To truly understand why avoidance may become addicted to you after no contact, we must first unpack what it means to have an avoidant attachment style. Attachment theory, which explores the ways in which we form emotional bonds, identifies avoidant attachment as a pattern where individuals tend to distance themselves from others in order to protect their emotional well-being. This style is often rooted in early childhood experiences where emotional needs were either unmet or inconsistently met. Children with avoidant attachment typically learn that expressing vulnerability or needing others doesn't guarantee comfort or support, so they develop mechanisms to keep their feelings in check. As adults, avoidant individuals can carry this pattern into their relationships. They appear emotionally distant or detached, often avoiding deep emotional intimacy. While they might desire connection on some level, they struggle with letting themselves depend on others or allowing others to depend on them. There's a deeply ingrained fear that intimacy could lead to rejection or hurt, so they retreat to maintain control over their emotions. This tendency to retreat isn't always conscious. It's more about self-protection. Avoidants often push others away when things get too close or vulnerable because it feels safer to maintain distance. This behavior can be incredibly confusing to those around them, especially when they seem to show initial interest or affection and then withdraw. It creates a push-pull dynamic that leaves others questioning what went wrong. But for the avoidant individual, this push-pull isn't about being cruel or intentionally confusing. It's about fear. Fear of being too exposed, fear of being hurt, fear of being engulfed. It's a deeply ingrained survival strategy that allows them to feel in control, even if it ultimately leads to emotional isolation. When no contact is introduced, it can feel like a loss of control for the avoidant person. Suddenly, they have no access to the emotional feedback loop they were used to. They might not have actively sought a relationship or closeness in the traditional sense, but the absence of that connection forces them to confront the very feelings they've spent years avoiding. For someone with avoidant attachment, no contact doesn't necessarily signal the end of feelings. It can actually bring those feelings to the surface in a way they are unprepared for. The distance creates a void where their emotions begin to swell, and the very thing they pushed away starts to seem all the more significant. It's important to note that avoidants aren't immune to longing or neediness. Rather, their patterns have made it difficult for them to express or acknowledge those feelings. No contact disrupts their emotional equilibrium, challenging their well-worn mechanisms of avoidance. They are left to navigate the very vulnerability they sought to avoid without the protection of their usual defenses. The paradox of distance is a fascinating and often painful dynamic for someone with an avoidant attachment style. On the surface, it may seem like they crave emotional distance or disengagement. After all, they tend to withdraw when things get too close, when emotions run deep, or when intimacy feels too vulnerable. But the reality is far more complex. The very distance they seek as a form of self-preservation often triggers a sense of longing and anxiety they are unprepared for, especially when it's introduced in the form of no contact. For avoidance, emotional distance is not simply about choosing to be alone or independent. It is an emotional defense mechanism, a way to keep the world at arm's length to prevent the risk of rejection, judgment, or emotional hurt. When they withdraw, they may feel a sense of relief, as if they've protected themselves from the vulnerability of being too exposed. The further they pull away, the more they feel they have control over their emotions, and the less at risk they feel of being disappointed or let down. However, this distance also creates an internal contradiction that is not easily resolved. For the avoidant person, being emotionally distant from someone doesn't mean they stop caring or feeling. It simply means they don't know how to process those emotions in a way that feels safe. So when no contact is introduced, whether through an intentional break or an unspoken gap in communication, it throws them into a state of emotional conflict. The absence of the other person disrupts their carefully crafted sense of control. At the same time, the lack of contact forces an avoidant individual to confront the emotions they have been pushing aside. They experience a heightened sense of uncertainty and discomfort because their primary coping mechanism, emotional distance, has been removed. The more they're kept at arm's length, the more they start to feel a kind of emotional withdrawal themselves. It's almost as if their brains begin to rewire in response to the absence, intensifying their awareness of the other person's significance. The longer they are without the individual they've distanced themselves from, the more they question whether they've made a mistake, whether they should have stayed closer, or if the person is really gone for good. This paradox can be painful to witness because on one hand, they resist connection. On the other hand, the very absence of that connection pulls them in like a magnetic force. It's not necessarily that they want to chase or pursue. Instead, they are faced with a feeling of emptiness, a longing for something they spent so much time guarding against. The absence, rather than confirming their initial belief that distance is safe, instead ignites an internal sense of loss and fear of abandonment. It's as though they must now confront their deepest vulnerability, whether they want to or not. In essence, the more distant they are, the more they are forced to experience the emotional void that distance creates. This emotional discomfort often manifests as a heightened awareness of the person they've withdrawn from. The paradox here is clear. The very distance they sought to maintain becomes the source of their emotional dissonance. It's an emotional tug of war that leaves the avoidant person feeling conflicted, torn between their need for distance and the rising sense of loss. Emotional regulation plays a critical and often misunderstood role in why avoidant individuals experience a heightened sense of longing and attachment after no contact. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, regulating emotions is not only challenging, it's a primary survival mechanism. This person often grew up in an environment where emotional expression was not consistently validated, or where the experience of emotional closeness felt unsafe or overwhelming. As a result, they developed a pattern of suppressing or distancing themselves from their feelings in order to maintain a sense of control over their emotional world. In adulthood, this emotional regulation manifests as a tendency to withdraw from emotionally intense situations. Avoidants are often highly self-reliant, not because they enjoy being alone, but because relying on others feels too risky. They have learned to manage their emotions by keeping them at bay, creating a barrier between themselves and the overwhelming vulnerability of emotional intimacy. This self-protection is often misunderstood as emotional unavailability, but at its core, it is an attempt to cope with fear and anxiety that stems from the unknown. Fear of getting hurt, fear of being too exposed, fear of being disappointed. However, when no contact is imposed, the natural emotional regulation mechanisms that an avoidant relies on begin to falter. Without the ability to control the flow of emotions through their usual defenses, withdrawal, disengagement, and emotional detachment, the avoidant person is left with an intense emotional experience they cannot easily push away. The absence of contact with the individual they've distanced themselves from brings a sudden flood of emotions they have been avoiding. These emotions may not be immediately recognizable as longing, but as discomfort or unease that grows stronger over time. The feeling of being cut off from the other person forces the avoidant to confront what they've been suppressing, their fear of abandonment, their unmet emotional needs, and their vulnerability. The more time passes without communication, the more intense these emotions become. They may not be able to articulate the exact feelings at first, but the internal pressure begins to mount. The person who they thought they could live without suddenly becomes the one they can't stop thinking about. And this isn't just because of the absence itself. It's because no contact has triggered a flood of emotions they don't know how to regulate or control. This struggle with emotional regulation can feel deeply unsettling. For avoidants, the absence of contact forces them to grapple with the discomfort of their own feelings, a process they've spent years trying to avoid. The feelings of longing and desire they might experience may seem paradoxical, but they are real. The person they once distanced themselves from becomes a symbol of safety, even if that safety felt overwhelming in the past. The withdrawal of this person brings them face to face with the emotional turbulence they've been trying to keep at bay. To complicate matters further, avoidants often feel a deep sense of shame when their emotions become unmanageable. They may view their desire for emotional connection as a weakness, a vulnerability that goes against their deeply ingrained belief that they should be independent and self-sufficient. This internal conflict makes it even more difficult for them to address or acknowledge their feelings. The emotions are there, but they're often masked by a defense mechanism that says, I don't need anyone, I'm fine on my own. The paradox is that underneath that veneer of self-sufficiency, there's a growing emotional turbulence that no amount of self-regulation can suppress. As a result, the longer no contact lasts, the more difficult it becomes for the avoidant individual to suppress or regulate their emotions. The absence of contact forces them to face the very emotions they've spent so long trying to bury. This brings an internal pressure to reconnect or find some form of resolution, even if they don't fully understand what they're feeling or why they feel this way. And because avoidants have historically relied on withdrawal as a way to regulate their emotions, the experience of no contact creates a paradox. The very thing that was once their emotional shield, distance, now becomes a source of emotional disarray. For individuals with an avoidant attachment style, the fear of intimacy and connection is not a superficial or fleeting concern. It is a deeply ingrained emotional struggle that often operates beneath the surface of their interactions. The core of this fear lies in a deep-seated belief that being truly known and loved comes with the risk of being rejected, criticized, or hurt. These individuals often grew up in environments where their emotional needs were either ignored, dismissed, or inconsistently met. Over time, they internalized the idea that vulnerability, opening up to another person, and allowing themselves to be seen could lead to pain, disappointment, and emotional neglect. As adults, these early experiences translate into an almost instinctual aversion to closeness. The more someone tries to get close, the more an avoidant person feels the urge to withdraw. The very act of intimacy, whether it's emotional or physical, is seen as a potential threat to their sense of safety and control. They have learned to manage their emotions by keeping others at a distance, maintaining a carefully curated sense of independence and self-sufficiency. To them, the risk of being emotionally dependent on someone feels akin to a loss of power, a feeling of being vulnerable and exposed. However, this fear of intimacy is paradoxical. Deep down, avoidants crave connection. They want to feel seen, understood, and loved, but they don't know how to allow themselves to experience those emotions without feeling overwhelmed. This internal tug-of-war between the desire for connection and the fear of intimacy creates a cycle of emotional confusion. They may have moments where they long for closeness, where they feel an emotional pull towards someone who provides comfort or support. Yet, as soon as they begin to feel that closeness, their fear kicks in, prompting them to retreat, sometimes even without consciously realizing why. This push-pull dynamic is one of the most challenging aspects of the avoidant attachment style. When someone with an avoidant attachment feels the threat of intimacy, their immediate instinct is to withdraw and protect themselves. But the very withdrawal they initiate often amplifies their fear because the distance paradoxically triggers a deeper fear of abandonment or isolation. The closer they get to intimacy, the more they fear that emotional exposure will lead to rejection or suffocation. The more they distance themselves, the more they are haunted by the possibility that they've pushed someone away permanently. No contact in this context becomes a critical moment for the avoidant person. While they may have initiated distance in the first place to maintain control and protect themselves from the perceived dangers of intimacy, the absence of contact forces them to confront the very thing they fear, the loss of connection. In the void created by no contact, they may begin to question whether the emotional bond they once had is truly lost or if they've missed an opportunity to create something more meaningful. The feelings of isolation that accompany no contact can trigger a kind of emotional urgency, a longing for connection they hadn't anticipated, and yet it is still tinged with the fear of what that connection might entail. This internal conflict is further complicated by the avoidance fear of dependence. To depend on another person emotionally feels, at its core, like a betrayal of their independence. Their self-worth is often tied to their ability to handle life alone, to prove that they don't need anyone else in order to be okay. Yet no contact strips away this illusion of independence. The emotional absence of the other person forces the avoidant to realize that, despite their best efforts to maintain emotional distance, they still need connection. They still need love. And this realization creates a profound sense of discomfort as it directly challenges the narrative they've built around their own emotional self-sufficiency. Furthermore, the avoidant person's experience with intimacy is often colored by past trauma or emotional injury, making the fear of intimacy even more intense. Their past experiences of abandonment, neglect, or emotional unavailability have led them to believe that intimacy is inherently dangerous. Every step toward closeness feels like a gamble, with the stakes being their emotional well-being. And when they are faced with the possibility of emotional intimacy, they may pull away, not just out of fear of the other person, but out of fear of their own emotions. The vulnerability that comes with true emotional intimacy feels not only like a threat to their security, but also like a floodgate that could open up long suppressed emotions they're not ready to face. The fear of intimacy and connection becomes a cyclical pattern of longing and withdrawal. While they may push people away in an attempt to preserve their emotional autonomy, the absence of contact triggers a realization of just how much they desire emotional closeness, even if they're terrified of it. Uncertainty plays a powerful and often destabilizing role in the emotional landscape of avoidance, particularly when no contact is introduced. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional stability is often maintained by creating a sense of predictability and control in their relationships. They may not consciously articulate this, but much of their behavior stems from a need to regulate how and when emotions are felt. And this is most easily achieved by keeping a safe distance from others. Predictability and control provide them with the illusion of emotional safety, as they can avoid being caught off guard by overwhelming feelings of dependency, vulnerability, or neediness. They can maintain a semblance of autonomy without fully confronting the deeper emotional dynamics at play. When no contact is implemented, however, the certainty that an avoidant person typically clings to is abruptly removed. In the absence of contact, they are thrust into a space of emotional uncertainty, a space that feels uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and even threatening. The lack of clear communication, the absence of regular emotional cues, and the withdrawal of the relationship dynamic they once relied upon all contribute to a growing sense of confusion and anxiety. They no longer know where they stand with the other person, and that lack of clarity breeds an internal sense of instability. This uncertainty is not simply a minor inconvenience for avoidance. It is an emotional trigger. For someone with avoidant attachment, uncertainty about emotional availability can bring up intense feelings of insecurity, fear, and self-doubt. Avoidants often protect themselves by attempting to control how they experience relationships, but when they are faced with uncertainty, that control slips through their fingers. The relationship is no longer in their hands, and they are left to wonder whether they've made a mistake by pushing the other person away. Have they lost something valuable? Are they still wanted? Did they overreact by creating distance in the first place? These questions swirl around, adding layers of anxiety to the emotional space created by no contact. As this uncertainty intensifies, so does the emotional pull to reconnect. The human mind is wired to seek closure and answers, and for avoidance, that desire for resolution can become almost obsessive in the absence of contact. The longer they go without hearing from the person they've distanced themselves from, the more their mind fixates on the unknown. What is the other person feeling? Are they angry, indifferent, or perhaps relieved? This uncertainty creates a void that is filled with unanswered questions and emotional projections. Without the stability of regular communication or emotional feedback, avoidants are forced to confront the ambiguity of the situation, which only heightens their anxiety and desire for clarity. This sense of emotional dissonance, where feelings of longing coexist with confusion, is profoundly uncomfortable for an avoidant person. The discomfort of not knowing where they stand with someone is often worse than the discomfort of facing emotional intimacy itself. In many cases, the absence of certainty feels more painful than the emotional distance they initially created. The mind races to fill in the blanks, crafting stories or worst-case scenarios in an attempt to regain some control over the unknown. The uncertainty becomes a breeding ground for anxious thoughts, insecurity, and doubt about the relationship itself. For avoidance, the emotional distress caused by uncertainty can lead to an addictive need to resolve the ambiguity. Even if they had previously distanced themselves for self-protection, the prolonged uncertainty triggers an emotional need to reconnect. The person they pushed away begins to feel like the one who can restore that sense of emotional stability, even if they are the source of the very discomfort. The desire to resolve the uncertainty becomes an emotional compulsion, often leading to a resurfacing of attachment thoughts and feelings. The fear of abandonment, of being permanently cut off from the emotional connection they once had, grows stronger with every passing day of no contact. Furthermore, the uncertainty causes avoidants to experience their own emotional vulnerabilities more acutely. When they are in the dark about how the other person feels, they are forced to confront their own feelings of attachment and neediness, things they've been actively avoiding. The longer the uncertainty lingers, the more these emotions surface and the more they feel compelled to seek answers. In the absence of clear communication, they may feel pulled into an emotional spiral where the absence becomes as painful as the connection they once shared. The paradox here is that the more they try to avoid the emotions they associate with closeness, the more these emotions come to the forefront when faced with the unknown. This fear of emotional abandonment is deeply entwined with the uncertainty. For avoidants, there is a constant underlying worry that their emotional needs will be rejected or unmet. The absence of communication only amplifies this fear, as it leaves them with nothing but their own internal doubts and projections. It's not just the absence of the other person that creates this tension. It's the inability to predict or control how the relationship will unfold in the future. The more unpredictable the situation, the more it challenges their emotional self-regulation and their coping mechanisms, pushing them to confront the very emotions they've worked so hard to keep in check. As the cycle continues, the uncertainty becomes a driving force that pulls avoidants back into a dynamic they once sought to avoid. The absence of clarity, the constant emotional tug of war, and the lack of resolution begin to feel unbearable, leading them to seek answers or closure. In the process, they may find themselves unexpectedly addicted to the very relationship they once distanced themselves from. The emotional longing becomes intertwined with the need for certainty, and the emotional void created by no contact becomes a powerful force in their psychological and emotional experience. The concept of healing and growth through boundaries may seem counterintuitive, especially when we consider how no contact or the intentional establishment of distance can create emotional turmoil for both avoidant individuals and those on the receiving end of their withdrawal. However, when examined more deeply, the creation of clear and firm boundaries through the absence of contact or the space between two people can serve as a catalyst for profound emotional healing and growth for those with an avoidant attachment style. No contact, while often perceived as a painful rupture, can be reframed as a necessary step towards self-awareness and emotional development. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, their relationship with boundaries is often complex and fraught with internal tension. On one hand, they may instinctively crave independence and emotional self-sufficiency, fearing that intimacy will result in a loss of control or vulnerability. On the other hand, they may experience deep feelings of longing or attachment to those they have distanced themselves from, even if they are unable to express or understand these emotions fully. This internal struggle arises from their ingrained fear of emotional dependency, which clashes with their natural human need for connection and closeness. In this context, boundaries, particularly the absence of communication or physical proximity, serve as a tool for self-reflection, self-regulation, and emotional healing. By imposing boundaries, avoidants are forced to confront their emotional vulnerabilities in a way that they otherwise might avoid. The absence of contact provides a period of emotional solitude in which they can reflect on their feelings, examine their attachment patterns, and begin to question their fears surrounding intimacy and connection. The space created by no contact allows for emotional processing to take place, something that is often hindered when avoidants are constantly engaged in relationships or interactions that reinforce their defense mechanisms. This time apart forces them to sit with their own discomfort, to face the very emotions they have been avoiding, whether it's the fear of abandonment, the shame of dependency, or the unresolved longing for emotional closeness. It's important to note that the process of healing through boundaries doesn't happen automatically or immediately. For avoidance, the initial reaction to no contact is often one of distress, confusion, or frustration. The absence of the other person may trigger feelings of emotional dissonance, as the very thing they feared, being abandoned or isolated, becomes a reality. Yet this is precisely what can spark growth. The discomfort of the distance compels them to reevaluate their attachment behaviors, to examine the reasons behind their need for distance, and to challenge their internalized beliefs about intimacy. In the absence of the familiar connection, they are confronted with the reality that their sense of self-worth and emotional well-being does not solely depend on the presence or approval of others. In this space of emotional solitude, avoidants can begin to reframe their beliefs about emotional closeness. They can start to differentiate between their fear of dependency, often tied to past trauma or neglect, and the actual desire for healthy, balanced connection. Boundaries give them the opportunity to acknowledge that emotional intimacy does not necessarily lead to suffocation or emotional injury, but rather it can be a source of strength and mutual support. By experiencing the discomfort of emotional withdrawal, avoidants can begin to understand that vulnerability doesn't always equate to weakness or exposure to harm. It can, in fact, be an avenue for deeper connection and self-acceptance. Furthermore, boundaries help avoidants develop healthier patterns of emotional regulation. Instead of relying on avoidance or withdrawal as a primary coping mechanism, the process of establishing boundaries teaches them how to assert their emotional needs in a way that respects both their own space and the needs of others. By stepping back and creating emotional distance, they are given the opportunity to clarify their emotions, identify their fears, and understand what they truly need from a relationship. They are no longer simply reacting to external stimuli, but are taking conscious ownership of their emotional experiences. This heightened awareness allows them to engage in relationships from a place of choice, rather than from a place of emotional reactivity or fear-based avoidance. No contact, while often painful in the short term, can also serve as a form of self-protection and self-care. For an avoidant individual, the creation of space between themselves and others allows them to regain a sense of emotional equilibrium. It can act as a much-needed pause to step back and assess the dynamics of the relationship, to determine whether it is truly meeting their needs, and to explore whether they are emotionally available for intimacy in a healthy and sustainable way. The absence of contact removes the external pressure of ongoing emotional interaction, providing them with the clarity needed to better understand their feelings and identify the patterns they need to break in order to foster healthier relationships in the future. Healing through boundaries also facilitates the development of self-compassion and self-acceptance. When avoidants can recognize that their withdrawal and emotional distance are not about rejecting others, but about self-protection, they can begin to show themselves the compassion they may have been unable to offer in the past. They can accept that their attachment style is not a character flaw, but rather a product of past experiences that can be understood, worked through, and eventually healed. By setting boundaries, they give themselves permission to acknowledge their emotional needs and to seek growth without feeling ashamed of their vulnerabilities. This self-compassion becomes the cornerstone for building deeper, more meaningful connections with others in the future. In the end, no contact and the boundaries it creates can be viewed as an act of emotional liberation, a chance for avoidants to reclaim control over their emotional lives and to break free from patterns that no longer serve them. The growth that comes from this period of distance is not just about learning how to navigate relationships differently. It is about understanding themselves at a deeper level, cultivating self-awareness, and ultimately building the emotional resilience needed to embrace both connection and vulnerability without fear. Through this process of boundary setting, avoidants can begin to heal from past wounds and learn to engage in relationships with a new sense of emotional openness, grounded in self-awareness and self-respect.